bored, defensive, frustrated? Please raise your hands if you felt like this in a meeting. Even in a meeting where your team has to make a big decision, a decision on something that really matters. You might work in an art gallery, maybe a company. You could be a volunteer in a community group or a teacher in a school like this. But let's imagine, some time ago, you and your colleagues sat down to address some challenge, something difficult with no clear answer. After a bit of discussion, someone, and it often is just one person, was given the job of coming up with a plan and taking it forward. Luckily, it wasn't you. But time has passed, and despite a great deal of effort from your colleague, the hoped-for outcome has not materialised. Your colleague is feeling defensive, and you don't want to be the one to dig into why the plan didn't work, because one, you feel it would be a bit mean. You're not sure what you would have done differently. And two, if you say too much, you might end up having to do it yourself. So you're okay with the plan, or the decision to stick with the plan for another year. But time rolls on, and ultimately the goal is only partly achieved. Does this experience sound familiar? It seems to me that different organisations are more similar than they look when it comes to making big or strategic decisions, possibly because human nature is a common factor. I grew so frustrated with this experience that I decided I'd figure out if there was a better way of making big decisions. And I'd like to share with you this evening some of the tips I picked up on that journey. But first, for the two lessons that kick-started my efforts. I grew up learning that self-reliance was a golden virtue up there with honesty. I loved being part of a team, but when there was something to be done, my instinct was to do as much as I could myself. And that habit became a handicap when I started to make big decisions, decisions that would impact the success of my team and the careers of the people in it. When I did solicit opinions, I'm ashamed to say it was after I'd made up my mind. You see, I'd come to believe that the skill of making big decisions was acquired intuitively, a bit like learning to cross the road without a pedestrian crossing. I felt I should just know how to do it. Well, I don't look back fondly on some of those earlier decisions, but I did learn that my first mistake was thinking I should make them by myself. This point is well illustrated by my favourite piece of research on decision making. It involved business school students and a whodunit murder mystery. The participants were required to identify the most likely culprit from 3 suspects. When the individuals worked alone, they identified the culprit 44% of the time. In groups of 4, where they were already familiar with one another, they were confident they'd chosen correctly, and they had done better than those working alone, but not by much. They identified the culprit 54% of the time. But the best outcome came about when the team included an outsider, someone the other 3 didn't know. The outsider didn't necessarily bring the right answer with them, but their presence was like a catalyst, causing everyone to behave differently. These teams uncovered more of the nuance, so they weren't as confident as the other groups. But here's the surprise. Their chances of identifying the culprit rose to 75%. So that was my first lesson. Teams make better decisions than individuals, and diverse teams make the best decisions. But having a great team is a bit like having the ingredients for apple pie. The apples, the butter, the cinnamon, and so on, all necessary, but not sufficient. All parts need to work together. Our meetings were often draining. Some people might not have prepared, and we'd waste time waiting for them to catch up. Or our discussions would be derailed because someone would continually bring up the single issue that affected only their own sector. Or perhaps worst of all was the colleague without direct responsibility for the problem, better described perhaps as the disinterested observer. Let me know how the rest of you get on. And it turns out that how the team works together really matters. Researchers investigating how different factors influence success reviewed over 1,000 financial investment decisions made by teams working in different industries. As expected, chance played a part. Almost 40% of the difference in the investment return was down to issues that the teams could not control. 40%. I find that scary and comforting. Think how often we beat ourselves up when the unexpected happens. Sometimes we need to give ourselves a break. But I love gathering information and researching it and analysing it. So I was disappointed to learn that the quality of the data and the analysis of it accounted for only 8% of the variance in results. But how the team made the decision accounted for more than 50% of the difference. The quality of the collaboration within the team, the approach they took to discussing the analyses and the underlying assumptions, the debate they had on risk factors, these discussions that I found so challenging to chair, these how factors mattered 6 times more than the data and its analysis. But to have great collaboration within a team requires everyone to contribute. And it can be a real problem to get everyone to air their honest opinion. There'll likely be at least one person who always agrees with the boss. Maybe they're new or they want a promotion. Or more junior people assume others know more than they do, and so if no one else raises the same point, they stay quiet. Candor in a team is key, and the leader must really want it and encourage it, and then it can become contagious. But you might have to get the ball rolling. Collating contributions anonymously can help protect ideas from politics and hierarchy, so you might want to get someone outside your team to collect responses so that the contributors can be separated from their suggestions. In doing this, you get the bullets on the table to spark the discussion without anyone being seen to have fired the shot. So those were my 2 lessons. When we're making big decisions, it's good if we use our team to help us, and how that team works together really matters. So now for those tips I mentioned on the 3 stages of making a big decision. The first stage, what is the problem? G.K. Chesterton said, "It's not that they can't see the solution, it's that they can't see the problem." It's important to properly understand what the real problem is, because leaders who can formulate clear problem statements get more done with less effort and move more rapidly than their less focused counterparts. But it can feel very frustrating to spend time in the problem. We're desperate to jump to a solution. Cognitive scientists tell us that this automatic quick thinking is natural for our brains, and it is the right approach sometimes, say for experts facing a familiar situation like emergency room doctors or firefighters. But it's not so good for complex and nuanced decisions where there's no clear feedback in the short term. It takes patience and perseverance to stay in the problem, to get past the symptoms to the cause itself. Take a high-performing but disgruntled team. Their leader decides that bigger bonuses are needed to reward the long hours they've worked, and sees the problem as getting the budget to do so. But that's really a solution disguised as a problem. It turns out the team is unhappy because they're so short-staffed for the tight deadlines they face. And although more money will undoubtedly raise morale in the short term, it won't address the need to change how deadlines are set, nor how to recruit and retain staff in the long term. So once you've taken the time to properly understand what the real problem is, you're going to want to move on to the second stage, generating some solutions. But be honest now. When you've been invited to a meeting to come up with ideas, when that rallying cry came, how did you feel? Did your heart sink? Here I have a confession to make. I am the irritating person who, if I care about what's on the agenda, I am likely to have a lot to say. And although I didn't talk till I was 4, it's taken me decades to know when to stop. Individuals in a group can only express one idea at a time if they want others to hear them. And a conversation hog or 2 can definitely get in the way. Indeed, studies have shown that when groups are together, the number of ideas per person declines as the size of the group increases. And there are other reasons why coming together to come up with ideas doesn't always work. First, People tend to make less effort when they know others might do it. They also worry about how others will judge their ideas. And there is a risk that the performance of your most talented team members will slip to match that of their less talented colleagues. This effect is well known in sports. If you practice with someone less competent, your competence level declines. But research tells us that we're likely to get the best, most creative solutions when the teams come together intermittently. So first, solicit ideas individually. You'll get more ideas, and although the quality of them will diverge widely, you're more likely to get some very creative suggestions. Then you can bring the team together to discuss and refine these. You'll need to decide how many people are on your team. There's no golden rule on this, it depends on the task at hand. But some researchers suggest that the optimal team size is 7. In my experience, you need at least 5 and no more than 9 to generate useful debate. As I mentioned before, you might want to anonymise ideas before you bring them to the group to help the debate. And if you can, leave time between group meetings to allow for further individual reflection before you come up with your shortlist of options. When you're evaluating these, it's a good idea to ask everyone to rank the options, rather than simply choosing a favourite. Ranking usually means a richer discussion. The reasons why your colleague chose differently may mean you rethink your preference. So at this stage, you've understood the problem, you've generated some ideas, and you've evaluated the options. Now is a good time to check in with your gut instinct, with your intuition, before the leader makes the decision, and now you have a plan. You're ready to go, right? Not quite. There's a third stage in making a big decision. You might want to de-risk your plan before you put it into action. There are 2 kinds of risk to consider. The first is the risk that there are aspects critical to your success that you don't identify up front, and therefore you can't manage. The infamous cash for ash fiasco in Northern Ireland is a great example of the law of unintended consequences. The Renewable Energy Initiative started over 10 years ago as a well-intentioned effort to reduce carbon emissions. The goal was to persuade taxpayers to switch from oil-fired boilers to boilers burning wood. However, the value of the government's subsidy was greater than the cost of the wood, so the boilers were left on 24/7, pumping out more CO2 than ever. One farmer who heated an empty chicken shed calculated he'd make profit of £1 million over 20 years. Just think, on average, that's £50,000 a year profit for more carbon emissions. Might that outcome have been avoided if the bureaucracy had paused to imagine the worst? We can learn from our mistakes, but it's not fun. It comes too late to change the outcome. And designing solutions requires us to be optimistic, so it's hard to think of risks at the same time. One way of identifying issues that we might otherwise have missed in the planning stages is to have a pre-mortem on a different day when you can allow yourself to be more pessimistic. A pre-mortem works like this. You say to your team, imagine it's 2025 and this decision that we made in 2023 has been a disaster. What happened? The team must come up with reasons why the plan has failed or been derailed, taking into account internal reasons as well as external factors. By identifying issues like this, we give ourselves a chance of managing them. After all, we kid ourselves when we're optimistic about stuff we don't manage or can't control. That's the first risk. The second risk in de-risking your plan before you put it into action is the risk that once you start on your path, you stay on it too long in the face of new information. No matter how hard you've worked to make this decision, you can't know that it's going to succeed. Remember in the research I mentioned earlier, almost 40% of the difference in investment returns was down to chance. And it's stressful and frustrating for all concerned if we set goals that turn out to be unrealistic for reasons outside our control. So what happens then if after 6 months or a year and things aren't going to plan? The harder you've worked, the more effort you've put in, the more difficult it is to accept that your plan might need to change. There's a name for this behaviour. It's called escalation of commitment, and it leads us to say things like, yeah, just been unlucky, we'll give it another year. One way of addressing this risk is to design a stop signal up front before you put your plan into action. A stop signal forecasts the interim results you might expect to see and when. Your decision won't have been executed in full, but you expect to have done enough to have some indication on the likely result. If the outcome is not what you hoped for, that'll be a sign that you need to stop and do something different. You won't let hope become your new strategy. Some years ago, our brief was to build a business in the Middle East. We defined our prospective customers, and based on research, we identified a service that we thought would be useful to them, and we built our strategy and our team accordingly. As a stop signal, we decided that if within so many months we hadn't been engaged to deliver a certain volume of that service, that we would stop and reassess our plan. Well, when the time came to test our stop signal, we had to admit that our prospective customers weren't interested in buying this service. Since we'd started, the economic outlook had changed, and instead, these customers were focused on rationalising their businesses, an area where we could help, but it wasn't the service we had expected to sell. We had to change tack and change team. Designing the stop signal up front allowed that later objective progress assessment to feel less personal to the team on the ground. They didn't feel so defensive because the stop signal reminded all of us that, despite unstinting effort, things not working out to plan was a possibility we had anticipated from the start. It's likely that all of us here will be or have been in the room when big decisions have been made. I wish I'd known more of this when I started leading teams, that we need diverse teams who work well together to help us make big decisions, and that there's a way of approaching those decisions that makes it more likely we'll make good ones. It does sound like more effort than just getting someone at the end of the table to take it on and do it themselves. So is the effort worth it? I think we can get our answer from Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner who has devoted most of his life to looking at how we make decisions. He says, the effort invested in getting it right should be commensurate with the importance of the decision. Thank you.